Strikes me about Bitcoin that's interesting is that we all have a very strong desire to understand it, which is a very good thing. But normally in the market for goods and services, it's not necessary for us to understand them completely in order to use them, right? Well, I don't understand how that pitch pipe I used works. That's the way the free market works. We rely on the knowledge of others, but in the early stages of a technology like Bitcoin, it turns out to be extremely important that we all understand it because there's so much skepticism and doubt, and also because we're just curious people. So when I first started looking into Bitcoin, I understood monetary theory because I had been studying it for 25 years. That wasn't a problem. I understood computer code and its value, which is a little bit unusual because there are plenty of people in the world that don't understand anything about why code is valuable at all or how it works or exists. So I understood that aspect of things. I understood open source networks because I've been playing in this world and running open source websites for a very long time. But there was one feature of Bitcoin that I didn't get, and I didn't want to approach it because it seemed too intimidating. And it's all about the word cryptography. You know, that was outside the realm of my comprehension. And I was terrified of it until one day I realized that I could never really talk about Bitcoin at all until I understood at least some basic structure of cryptography. And so I watched, several videos and about cryptography, read a couple of books about cryptography, but even then, it still eluded me like why cryptography was so essential to this technology of human liberation. And it's the brilliant and I consider prophetic Daniel Krawisz, who is to my right, who explained it all to me in a series of astonishing articles that he ran just this past summer, right, for the Mises Circle. He's a genius at both comprehending the subject and explaining it as an expositor. He has a book coming out in 10 days.
Very good.
Yeah, I've been urging him to write this book and he keeps like, I'm getting there. But it needs to be done sooner rather than later because the fate of the world is waiting. Everything rests on this book. This book is everything. And it must be published soon. Like, we're suffering in its absence. Okay, Daniel? Okay. So Daniel's going to be giving us a quick talk, so please pay close attention. Daniel Krawisz on human freedom and cryptography.
Good morning. Let me add something to my bio. Yeah, I've been working in South America with Monero, formerly BTC Global. They're going to make a lot of cool Bitcoin products for the rest of the world, everything not in the United States. Other news, my stars are still in my eyes because I just learned the other day that I met Ross Ulrich, the Dread Pirate Roberts, a few years ago, before he even started the Silk Road, when I was doing 3-day startup. So when that happened, I said to my friend Jeremy, I said, Jeremy, that Ulrich, he's going to be the greatest criminal mastermind of the 21st century. No, I did meet him, I didn't say that though. So this talk is on why libertarians should understand cryptography. This is not about Bitcoin exactly, it's why you should take it apart and try to see a little bit about how it works. We know Bitcoin is great, but why, right? Bitcoin is made out of a bunch of sort of simple ideas, simple cryptographic primitives, and you can put these together in all kinds of different ways. Bitcoin has always been sort of the gem, the holy grail of the cypherpunk movement. So, but there's all kinds of other things in the cypherpunk vision that we should be on top of, we should be anticipating and ready for. Bitcoin is going to be the coolest, though. We already have that. So, need to understand it, be the first adopters, and promote it for other people. And we need to have the vision of the free internet so that we know what it looks like. We know what we should be aiming towards. So this is one reason to understand cryptography. Cryptography has some interesting properties, very interesting for libertarians. So what this means, can't hold a gun to an equation, what this means is that the state's primary advantage, the thing they focus on, the guns and the coercion, doesn't help them as much. They do have the NSA and lots of, they hire lots of cryptographers to work for them, but cryptography is individualistic. Even a very simple, a little computer like this, millions of times more powerful than all the computers from a few years ago anyway, but this thing I can make a puzzle, a cryptographic puzzle on it that is unsolvable by all the rest of the computers in the world, or even all the rest of the computers that ever will exist. Not true of guns. If you have one gun, you can't defeat all the other guns. So this is a good reason to start getting interested in understanding cryptography. So the individualistic nature of cryptography is, well, it's really great. I mean, this strategy might actually work. Okay, so here's another reason to be interested in cryptography. There are actually lots of great libertarians who come out of the cryptographic tradition, but when I was learning libertarianism through the Mises Institute and so on, I never heard of any of these guys. So if you came to Bitcoin from the libertarian economics side, you may not have heard of Whitfield Diffie, but he's a great libertarian. And Jeff Riggenbach has never done a libertarian tradition podcast on him. But the Diffie-Hellman protocol is probably one of the most libertarian things ever invented. And if you don't know what it is, look it up. So now I'm going to really get you interested in cryptography. So this is one of the reasons that you may not have put enough interest in it before. By the way, if you already know lots about cryptography, then this talk isn't necessarily for you, but you should learn economics then too. That's my advice. Anyway, this word is wrong. So the word cryptography, it means secret writing. That's not what cryptography is. Modern cryptography grew out of the problem of secret writing, but when people developed public key methods in the late 60s and early 70s, they started to realize that they had all sorts of other things that they could do. Let me see. Right, so this is confidentiality. It's one service that can be provided with cryptography, but it is not, it doesn't characterize the whole thing by any means. So this is a better definition of cryptography, the study of the security of protocols for the provision of a service. So essentially we're talking about accomplishing some service between a group of people and a protocol, which we attempt to provide the service, and then we study it to see, does it actually work? How can you cheat on the protocol? How can you figure out how can you try to get around it, right? And if you can't, then that's a good thing, because then you can provide the service. So essentially, you should think of cryptography as free market law plus computers. And, well, the computers are necessary because there's lots of arithmetic that is ordinarily involved. But if you were very good at arithmetic, you wouldn't really need the computers, theoretically. Wouldn't recommend that. But this is what it is. This is not an analogy. That's law. If you're talking about people coming together, their interactions are mediated by computers, and they're attempting to develop rules by which they can cooperate with one another. Well, that's that's law, you know? It's a fully functioning system of free market law that has a great tradition behind it, and I think that's the main reason libertarians should be interested in it. So here's the method of cryptography. Very briefly, define a service. So we already talked about confidentiality. If you can have confidentiality plus deniability, and that's provided by something like OTR, off-the-record messaging. You can also have non-repudiation, which is the opposite. That means that once you send the message, then you can't later deny it. That's what Bitcoin uses. Once you send off a transaction, you can't later say, oh, I didn't actually want to spend that one. That's what we use for Bitcoin. So adjudication, cryptography doesn't provide that right now, but really there's no reason why you couldn't try to build an adjudication type protocol on top of cryptographic primitives. And really I want you to think about cryptography, and I want you to think about free market law at the same time, because they're really two branches of the same thing. So define the service, now design a protocol attempting to provide it, and then try to cheat and give the academic accolades to the best cheater. Because you want to know everything possible that's wrong with it. So you need to have a nice competitive system to figure out who's the best cheater, right? Finally, I think it would be great if we actually had a different word for this than cryptography, because as I pointed out, the word is wrong. So I don't know Greek, but if somebody can tell me the Greek word for the study of the security of protocols, that would be great. Right, so yeah, cryptography is a great tradition, but it's not, and it's very individualistic, but I don't want you to think that it's all, we know that it's not all hunky-dory, right? But the way we do cryptography now, even given that the government owns, most of the cryptographers, is still way better than the way we do other branches of law today, right? So the government owns lots of cryptographers whose job is to break your security, but this is like way better than the way we do other law, right? So this is like law if there was no concept of legislation and the government had to hire lots of lawyers to sort of trick you into signing slave contracts. That's sort of that's like how cryptography works. So it's still a wonderful tradition. Cryptographers don't like trusted third parties, which is like amazing because in the ordinary law traditions that we're sort of used to, it's all like, well, of course we need the universal third party. How else would we do anything? A third party, that's a vulnerability. Well, a trusted third party. Right, Hobbes's argument amounts to the assertion that a universal trusted third party is the only viable one for certain services, but cryptographers don't believe that, at least when it comes to computer-mediated interactions, because they already have lots of protocols that are way better, right? So there's actually a proof in cryptography that says any trusted third party can be emulated by a distributed protocol. So yes, mathematics shows that we don't need the state. Okay, that's a joke because the assumptions that go into this proof are not quite viable to the issues that confront us in the real physical world, but still, I think this is a very interesting thing. So here's another example of a way that I think the cryptography tradition is superior to the legal tradition that we have today. So cryptographers like tradition, okay? Libertarian legal theorists also tend to like tradition a lot. But here's the difference is that in cryptography you define the service that you're trying to provide. You have a careful definition of what it is you're actually trying to do. And when you have that, there is actually an objective difference between a protocol that has not been broken and a protocol that has been broken. So you can throw away the broken protocol. And the tradition aspect comes in when you have a protocol that nobody's broken yet. For a very long time, if nobody's broken it, that's not proof, but it's good evidence that you've got something that works well. Whereas the way people think about tradition in the ordinary legal tradition is more like we don't really know what the service is, so people are sort of afraid to tamper with it. That's sort of what the arguments about tradition are in the non-cryptographic legal realm. So this is a much superior position than someone like Hayek, I would say, because if you actually define what the service is, well, as I said, there's an objective difference between a broken protocol and one that hasn't been broken. So if you ask people what is justice, you'll get a different answer from everybody. So that's a problem because we're not defining the service. So once you start thinking about things this way, you come up with some new ways to think about some other things that we have in our world. So here's how you should think about the founding fathers of the United States. They were amateur cryptographers, whatever, came up with a broken protocol. So Constitution is broken, scrap it, come up with something else. So I put this quote in here because I didn't want people to think that I hadn't come up with this objection. So this is a sort of a famous quote in cryptography. If you think cryptography is the answer to your problem, then you don't know what your problem is. And what this basically means is that you can understand the theory of cryptography, and that is not going to make you good at designing a protocol or at security in general. There's a lot more to learn before you can get good at that. And we can see that in the Bitcoin cypherpunk sort of community now, where all these people are getting interested in cryptography, but they're amateurs and they're coming up with things that don't quite work right. That's sort of what happened with CryptoCat, although it's getting a lot of fixes now. Hopefully one day it'll be really great. But my point here is that if you want to think about social implications and you want to think about a free internet, then the theory of cryptography is what you should be studying. It's just like how you can know a lot about economics and still not be any good at entrepreneurship or investment, right? Summary, computer-mediated protocols are empowering to the individual. There are huge opportunities to make the world a freer place by using cryptographic software. Cryptography should be seen as a branch of free market legal theory. Cryptography has a much better tradition than the libertarian legal tradition, and libertarian legal theorists could learn a lot from it. And that's just because there are a lot more cryptographers and they've done a lot more work. I'm not saying that we don't have great libertarian legal theorists now, it's just that cryptography is a big subject. Plenty of great libertarians made their contribution in the field of cryptography, and we should know enough to honor them. So, recommended books. Okay, well, Tucker already told you about that one. So here are 3 cryptography textbooks that I enjoyed a lot. You should read them in this order. These are in order of how theoretical they get. So Satoshi's original paper is very readable. There's so much more in Bitcoin than is in the paper, though, so I don't think you understand Bitcoin after you read the paper. And these last 2 items, they're not about cryptography, but the art of Unix programming, that'll teach you the Unix philosophy, and Richard Stallman essays, that'll teach you about the free software movement, and these are both important side issues. So the assumptions that go into designing a cryptographic protocol are quite similar to the way that libertarians think about the state of nature and the development of society and law from out of nothing, because you tend to start out with a bunch of independently operating computers that don't need necessarily have a prior relations established with one another. And the reason cryptographers think in this way is because, well, this is where the interesting problems are, first of all. And second, if you go outside of this model, then either there isn't a problem, like if all computers are just controlled by some central agency, then there really isn't a problem at this point. If you can break into other people's computers, then you don't have security at all. So the assumption has to be sort of individual, independently operating computers, and that are attempting to interact and develop a protocol for cooperating with one another. And so next, oh my God, how did this slide get in here? You weren't supposed to see this. Conclusion, come on. If you're smart enough to read Human Action, you're smart enough to read a cryptography book, and if you're math phobic, just get over it. It's not that bad. Invent a protocol so useful, someday even the government will have to use it. But okay, realistically, that's maybe, but that's what the goal should be. And Satoshi, if you're watching, thanks. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce now my dear friend Michael Goldstein. Every time somebody says the word Michael Goldstein, they always say, my dear friend Michael Goldstein. Have you noticed that? Yeah, no, everybody talks about you that. My dear friend Michael Goldstein. Also known as Michael Bitstein, actually. So a student at the University of Texas, founder of the Mises Circle, my mentor in many ways on the Bitcoin question. You know how sort of humbling, if not humiliating, it is for a man of my learning and stature to have to go crawl to a small little, junior in college to explain how the world works. But that's the situation I've been in for the last, year with Michael. So I'd like to introduce him now.
Okay, fantastic. So I got into Bitcoin, I guess, about a year ago. And I've known about it for even longer, thanks to Daniel. But I got into it thanks to, kind of Austrian economics and looking at it as money. And over the past, I guess, couple months, I've been reading a lot about the history of the ideas that go into Bitcoin, and I've come to like to view Bitcoin not only as money, but from a broader perspective as property. So I kind of want to give a kind of libertarian property view of Bitcoin in this talk. So I want to give a quick theory of property in the libertarian tradition. Scarcity is the prerequisite for property norms. In order for us to need rules on who gets to use what, there needs to be some sort of conflict. So any physical good is subject to this just thanks to the laws of physics. And because of this, we need some way of coming up with the rules of who gets to use what. And the libertarian answer is, just appropriation through homesteading. So if you were the first person to use something, it's yours. Or voluntary transfer of title. If someone gives it to you, or you have a voluntary trade, then you now have justifiable ownership and the right to exclusively control a certain good. And of course, we need some sort of technology for actually delineating these property norms, like actually showing who gets to use what. And Hans-Hermann Hoppe talks about the existence of an objective, intersubjectively ascertainable link between owner and owned good. And essentially, he's meaning that you need objective ways for other people to be able to recognize the value that you have placed on a good so as to make it property. And of course, you also need to further this by making ways of showing this. If I put a fence around my home, or if we have social conventions that kind of set general rules, like if you get up from your seat, someone else can't steal it. It's not a real rule, but it's one that we come up with as a way to do that. So anyway, I want to look at how Bitcoin fits this. And of course, Jeffrey Tucker talked about how Bitcoin does something weird in the digital realm by creating scarcity. We only have a finite set of Bitcoins, so it will be no more than 21 million ever. This is one of the first scarce digital goods. I'd say maybe URLs and IP addresses could constitute another one, but this is the first finite set of scarce digital goods, which of course make it great for money. And of course we needed a way to appropriate this, and we have homesteading. People mine Bitcoins. They are the first ones that they invest some computational power, and then the protocol allows them to claim ownership of it. And we also have voluntary transfer of title, which is this a Bitcoin transaction. I send the title to you. And of course we have this technology that we're using to delineate who owns what is public key cryptography. We're able to set up this protocol where only the person who has this secret number gets to use a given good that's tied to the protocol. So in history, there's a problem of actually securing title. So I can say, oh, I own this, but how do we get that known? How do we make sure that the community will, see that it remains that way? So historically, we've had a lot of written records. People have, I have a deed to this piece of land, stuff like that, or receipts that show the transaction happened. But these are sometimes easily, sometimes more difficult, but they can be forged or destroyed. People can change the history of what happened. I can, just burn down a whole building that has all these, registries of information, and then who actually owns it? No one has that way to go back and claim, oh, I was the just owner of this good. And of course, if we collect these informal records, because I want to, informal records like receipts to, figure out who owned what, that can be very difficult. It's also very costly in terms of time and mental effort. So we have the internet now, so what if we create an online database? Well, there's many problems that can occur. One is, if you have a centralized database, if I just have my server and I hold all the property titles to everything, that's one person that is in charge of all of that. So there's trust issues, and as Daniel pointed out, that's not necessarily, I'm a great guy, but that I can be vulnerable. I can make sure that no one can't hack into my server, for instance. It might be possible. And so so any hacker with a computer can access servers and potentially find ways to hack into these databases. So how about we come up with a distributed solution? And this is when we get into the kind of historical cypherpunk ideas. And there's a computer scientist who is Austrian-leaning, and he has many brilliant ideas I'm going to get back to a lot over the course of this talk, and his name's Nick Szabo. And he proposed a secure distributed title database to prevent fraudulent attacks against property rights in the future. Transferable rights are enforced entirely by protocol and owned by a particular entity, but possessed and relied on by the public. This technology will give us public records which can survive a nuclear war along the lines of the original design of the internet. So you probably, this was written in 1998, but today in 2013, and as recently as 2009, this was the blockchain. And so the blockchain is this now distributed solution to the problem of securing property titles and creating a database that holds all of these. The blockchain is the ultimate technology for securing these titles of scarce digital goods. We have this for the Bitcoin already. We have this title. These values are associated with these addresses, but perhaps there's also more we can do with it. It's unforgeable once it's mined. The further back it is in the blockchain, the more just absolutely difficult it is to go back and change it. It's verifiable. Anyone who's running a Bitcoin node, you don't have to have a whole mining rig. Your computer is simply going through and checking all the calculations easily, and you can see that everyone is correct. Everyone was justifiable in the property norm sense. And it's decentralized. Everyone who downloads Bitcoin QT has a copy of this entire registry. And it's resilient. I hang out with a lot of people who sometimes, will give the arguments like, oh, well, what if, the grid goes down? What if, we have some electromagnetic pulse? That's not something to really worry about. There might be times that it halts, our current usage of Bitcoin. But if I have the blockchain stored in some place, I can put it on a flash drive and send it up to space. It doesn't matter what's going on Earth. The story of who owned what will still be there for us. So now that we kind of have an idea of this, I want to talk a little bit about contracts. And Stefan Kinsella, who I think is talking later, he defines a contract as a relation between two or more parties which includes legally enforceable obligations between them. And if you're familiar with the Rothbardian tradition, this is explained through contracts come about, valid contracts through the title transfer theory of contract, which is saying that all contracts, all voluntary transactions are really transfers of titles to certain goods. And he want to further say that any future-oriented title transfer is necessarily conditional, as are exchanges of title. So if you do X, then Y will transfer to you. So anyway, so with this conditional, that I'm a computer science student, so as that I think that's if then is something you do all the time in computer programs. So this brings about the idea of smart contracts. So a large cost of doing business is trust and security. Having to trust that someone will do something correctly, trust that your stuff will remain safe. And historically, once again, we've had contracts that are based on paper. We write up a big contract, we have people sign it, notarize it, etc. And we also need humans, and humans cost a lot. I'm eagerly waiting for robots to take over so that everything is super cheap. So let's digitize what we can. And once again, Nick Zaber is here with some brilliant ideas, and he talks about the basic idea behind smart contracts is that many kinds of contractual clauses can be embedded in hardware and software in such a way that makes breach of contract expensive and sometimes prohibitively so for the breacher. A quick aside, in the hotel, I was in the elevator and I had to put my key in to get to my room, and that was a great example of a smart contract. It set up a piece of hardware and software that would give you access to what room you were actually supposed to have access to. And if you did not, it didn't let you. I'm sure there's a way I could go in and hack into the elevator, but that would take way too much time and it's not worth it. I'll just go to the 6th floor. So, we talked about Bitcoin as these, titles to property, Bitcoin's property. So, it seems like obviously Bitcoin could be a good tool for smart contracts. And so Bitcoin transactions have space for arbitrary data, and it also has scripting capabilities. So you can program smart contracts. Not all of this is, so the protocol has built-in methods for creating smart contracts based on Bitcoin transactions. I will say they're not implemented yet, so this is something that will be in the future. People will find ways to recognize these contracts. So there's a talk by Google developer and Bitcoin developer Mike Hearn that goes through a lot of these, and it's one of the most brilliant talks on Bitcoin I've ever heard. It's actually what sparked a lot of my friendship with Jeff, because we were just giggling like schoolgirls over it, so watch it. And I also recommend looking up the Bitcoin wiki page on contracts, but I would like to cover a couple examples. So one of them would be escrow and dispute mediation, and someone earlier mentioned multi-sig transactions, and that's exactly what this escrow is. So you can have M of N transactions. And what that means is you need a certain number of keys out of a total number for a transaction to go through. So me and a merchant can decide ahead of time who we want to trust as a third party. And then we create a transaction that requires 2 of the 3 of us to sign it for it to go through. And so this essentially establishes third-party arbitration. What it's doing is basically locking away Bitcoins for the transaction, and if everything goes fine and they ship things to me and I like it, the 2 of us sign it, everything's fine. If we have a dispute, we now have a third party that we've chosen to help us decide who's in the right. It's nearly trustless. You have to hope, just like in the real world, you chose a good mediator and they're not colluding with the merchants. And also, as far as I know, if they run away, the money is locked there, but at least they don't get to take it from you. But we talked about let's try digitizing. So let's try digitizing. So we have external state contracts. So we determined that people are really expensive. So if we have this mediator, why not just use a computer? So external state contracts use computer programs called oracles that run on servers. And they interpret external data. So essentially you can program the dispute and its resolution into the contract itself. You can say if X happens, then these bitcoins will go to this person. If Y happens, bitcoins will go to this person, etc. So, and then the oracle signs as that third signature in the 2 of 3 transaction, or however complex you make it. So examples of this could be like sports betting and inheritance. You can have a computer that's watching ESPN to find out who wins, and then it automatically sends out the bitcoins to whoever won. One of my favorite is assurance contracts. And libertarians constantly get the question, who will build the roads? And the reason for this is because people worry about free riders, and there's no incentive to actually build it because you don't want other people benefiting for what you paid for and getting it for free. So we have assurance contracts, which are kind of like the Kickstarter model. We have an opcode sig hash anyone can pay. And essentially what this does is sets up, I will do X if I get this amount of bitcoins. So people send in transactions of their donation to it. And when the total adds up, I bundle it up and I pay it through. So this is really cool because intellectual property, people oh, well, how would you make money if you didn't have the force of government helping me make money? Well, with creative goods, you can say, oh, well, I won't write this chapter of this book until I get X amount of money. People donate that, and then and once I get it, I put it out. I've made the money I've wanted, that I wanted to make from it, and now everyone can share in the good on Pirate Bay. It really doesn't matter. I made the money I wanted. So you can also extend this further with dominant assurance contracts, and there was a paper by Alex Tabarrok that described a situation. It's a little more complex, but essentially it creates it so that the dominant strategy is for people to invest. So that's worth looking into as well, and people have thought of how to apply that in Bitcoin as well, a protocol for that. So have at it, free riders. So also want to get to an idea called smart property. So we've talked about scarce digital goods being, their titles being within the blockchain, you get to trade it. But smart property are physical goods with hardware and software that incorporate cryptography into their security and ownership. So imagine a thing that has public and private key pairs that are tied to the blockchain. So you have their address on that. But a more simple example of like a smart property, you can have a fob key that opens a door. I'm sure you've used one of those before, and it has a cryptographic key. But then imagine this key pair associated with the blockchain, and you can do it with a Bitcoin transaction. So now ownership of these physical goods are dictated by the blockchain. So now we can combine that with various smart contracts, and you have robust digital ownership agreements that can only be done through this voluntary title transfer of a Bitcoin transaction. So people have tried to extend blockchains in other ways. There's a thing called Namecoin. So we have Bitcoin as a ledger for a finite number of values and their relations with public addresses. It's great for money. But imagine a blockchain that's also for a wider variety of security titles that we can use for other things. So instead maybe have namespaces that represent some name to something, like a name to some property in something, like a deed. But Namecoin somewhat attempts to do this, and I have reservations for various reasons, but what it attempts to do is create a distributed DNS. So if we have, you mine Namecoins and are able to register bit.bit addresses, and it's in this distributed DNS that has the same robustness and resilience as the blockchain for Bitcoin, and thus it can't succumb to censorship by government, such as like with WikiLeaks. And it can do other things as well. And there's also the idea of blockchain notaries, which already exist, and you can put a hash into a cryptographic hash into the blockchain to show that this existed at this time, this version of something. And if someone tries to prove that they created it later, you know that, oh well, it's on the blockchain. I created it at this time. So anyway, to sum it up, Nick Szabo, once again, while thugs can still take physical property by force, the continued existence of correct ownership records will remain a thorn in the side of usurping claimants. So if you have a good that's like its property title is cryptographically or not so cryptographically tied to the blockchain, and someone, you have a car like that and someone steals it, well, they can steal it and they can have it. If it's good, smart property, they might not even be able to operate, but say they have it, they can't go back and change the history that says who actually owned that good. And I think this is a really important thing from a libertarian perspective. It leverages power against the state. If you have something that's on the blockchain, they can be the state. They can go steal from you, but they can't change the narrative. They can't make us believe that they somehow legitimately got a hold of a certain good. And I think novelist Milan Kundera put this great, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The blockchain is a permanent history of property titles, and it tells us the history of who justifiably owned what. And no matter what the state does to try to tell a different narrative, the blockchain will always be there, whether on our computers, whether on a flash drive in space, it doesn't matter. They cannot change the narrative, and this takes away a lot of legitimacy in their various plundering. So I have various reading that I'd recommend for property theory, some Hans Hermann Hoppe and Stefan Kinsella, and I highly recommend the works of Nick Szabo. And once again, please look up the Bitcoin contracts wiki page. So thank you very much.
So yeah, we've got a number of interesting characters here. I think Netflix is making a TV miniseries out of this conference called "Orange is the New Green." I don't know. Wasn't brilliant, but there. So, because we're off schedule a little bit, we're going to do a Q&A session here right now, and then we're going to move immediately into Stefan Kinsella's lecture, and then we'll be able to break early for lunch and have more time to sort of talk with each other and hang out. So let's go ahead and start that Q&A session now. We have the microphone. Hopefully it's working this time.
Yeah, hi. My question is for Daniel. You have a master's in physics, and I have a bachelor's in physics. I studied under Mark Edwards, who's he works with like Wolfgang Ketterling and people like that who have worked with Bose-Einstein condensates and then quantum computing. And so my question is, have you thought about the implications of the fact that we'll probably see quantum computers coming online like within our lifetime that'll have some kind of definitely abilities to crack like SHA-256 and stuff like that within reasonable amounts of time?
Okay, well, there's a lot to be said about quantum computing, but basically don't worry about them. I'm not an expert on this issue, but I have looked into it a little bit. But basically, most of the quantum computers that exist today are not general purpose computers. They're special purpose. They only do one thing, and in fact, it's not even clear yet that you can actually build a general purpose quantum computer. So there is an algorithm that can break the versions of public key cryptography that we have today, and it's called Shor's algorithm. But the best it's ever done is to factor the number 21. So it's a long time before we'll be able to get to numbers that have thousands of digits, which is what we have now. Also, there are other versions of public key cryptography, such as lattice-based cryptography, that are not broken by quantum computers. So if we ever get powerful enough quantum computers, we can just switch to the other version. And also, quantum computers do not break ordinary cryptography. They only break public key cryptography. A quantum computer can get through. It can break a key in twice as fast, basically, as, well, that's not true. A key for a quantum computer acts like a key that has half as many bits as one for an ordinary computer. So you just use keys that are twice as long when you're doing ordinary cryptography. And for public key cryptography, you just switch to lattice-based cryptography.
I missed the question, but I understood what it was about. I also have something to add. We already have technologies that allow to implement cryptocurrency without cryptography, like Ripple and open authentication. So it doesn't involve cryptography, and it supports actually authentication and money transfer. Thanks.
So my question is on smart contracts. It's such an interesting idea, and there's so much that could be done with it. But my question is, what's in that space? What's the easiest thing that maybe we could tackle first? I mean, if you talk something about like Bitcoin agents, there's this idea of storage that's kind of illustrated out what we could do with it. So same thing for smart contracts. What's the easiest problem?
Is this on?
That's a good question.
Well, I do know that Mike Hearn himself has already implemented microtransactions payment channel, which is one of the ones, if you go to the wiki, it's one of the 7 that he describes. He's already implemented that into Bitcoin J, which is a Java implementation of Bitcoin. And Amir Taki's Libitcoin and SX platform has the capability for multi-sig transactions already. So, and outside of Bitcoin itself, you can already do smart contracts with a cryptographic financial library called Open Transactions by Fellow Traveler. So look into that as well.
Thank you.
It reminds me of the general frustration I've felt ever since discovering this world of Bitcoin, that you can see the future, and it just you get so impatient for it, right? Like, why is it taking so damn long to get here?
Yeah. Well, what's great about like smart contracts is it allows us to do much more functional things than simply what we've been able to do with paper. There's so much more, like the idea of like the external state that we can have just computer programs that are autonomously running basically legal orders is fascinating, and I can't imagine what we'll be able to get out of it. The fact is that great things are coming our way.
Hi. Hate to take up a second question, but I didn't see other hands. Simply, if I understand you right, can essentially any intellectual and real property be embedded in a blockchain conceivably?
So that's a technological problem. So like the idea would be finding ways to do that, and I think that there will be more ways that we can tie physical things to these digital blockchains. Right now, in our current world, no, it's not really that case. We'll see what colored coins bring us, but I think smart property, just having, once we have the ability to have hardware that can connect to the blockchain, I think people will start to associate more physical property with the blockchain. But this is a technological problem. It's not, so it's almost hypothetical, but it's something that is potentially conceivable.
To give a concrete example, in Mike Hearn's speech, he talks about vehicles and how you could have the ownership of a vehicle tied to the blockchain, in the sense that right now, for example, if you own a BMW, the key is tied to BMW, right? So they can reproduce a new key for you if you were to lose it. You could instead have the key be tied to a blockchain, and it would be a digital key, as they are today. The physical key fob is usually you just plug it in, and it's the same for any vehicle. So that would be a very easy implementation of smart property.
Right, and I was actually originally I actually had the car example originally in my speech, but I had to whittle it down a little bit. Going on that, just to imagine what smart contracts can bring to that. So let's imagine where we can have this car, where at least the hardware and software that's running the car has a tie to the blockchain, so that you can trade that ownership. Maybe not the whole car itself, obviously. You can pick it up and take it away. You just can't do anything with it. But you can add on assurance contracts, or the same, anyone can pay hash opcode. And then you can create smart contracts that are loans. So someone could say, you have partial ownership, you can use the car until I get X amount. And once I get that, full ownership of the car is transferred to you, and my public key and private key no longer are associated with the car. So you can have a loanable good as well.
Hey, Jesse Bacon. Trying to envision what like a modular adjudication system would look like, and if you guys have any, or if anyone else has had any vision for that, and how it would touch back into the other parts of the contractual system.
A what? A modular
Adjudication system?
adjudication system. Yeah.
Like you described.
Yeah.
Just read Chaos Theory by Robert Murphy. He doesn't talk about computers in that one, but so, that's the next stage in the research, is to come up with that. But I don't have anything better than that right now.
All right, thanks.
I think in general, like with Robert Murphy's idea of how legal orders can exist in purely free market, and then understanding what is possible with smart contracts.
Right.
Over time, we can develop more modular digital.
You know what, Michael, the big problem with this whole literature that I've always detected and frustrated me, the problem that they all rely on law. In the past, the theories about stateless societies and the possibility of human association, there's always a presumption that the law has to work well, and the law is always compromised by.
I think most people just don't understand what law is.
But what the world you're describing is basically a world that's sort of self-managing, right? And that's what's remarkable about cryptography in the digital age, is that it makes everything sort of manage itself. It's
right, and also with smart contracts, it's going back to original contract law. Like what we see with Lex Mercatoria, where contracts create the laws, and people get to try new rules. Right. So with that, we'll get to try all sorts of new things. And I don't want to try to guess what people are going to do. That's very entrepreneurial.
And Michael, if it doesn't work, we'll just make you the dictator. Everything will be okay.
We can go with that.
Okay,
I know you don't want him to be the dictator.
We're going to bring up Doug French to introduce Stefan Kinsella right now. So.